The sound wasn't a scream. It was the sickening, wet crunch of steel biting through bone that echoed off the canyon walls of the Mogollon Rim. In the high country of the Arizona Territory, silence is usually a man's best friend. But on that freezing November morning in 1878, the silence was shattered by a violence that would change history for two solitary souls. Jedediah Coulter had set his traps for Grizzly, but what he found thrashing in the iron jaws wasn't a beast. It was a woman, an Apache fierce enough to kill him even while bleeding out, and the decision he made in that heartbeat would bring a war party to his doorstep before the sun could thaw the frost. The wind in the Superstition Mountains carried the scent of pine needles and coming snow, but to Jedediah Coulter, it suddenly smelled like copper. Jed was a man carved from the same granite as the cliffs he walked. At 42, he had a beard streaked with early grey and hands that were scarred from skinning knives and rope burns. He was a trapper, a former scout for General Crook, who had left the army when the orders turned from pacification to extermination. He preferred the company of mules to men. He checked his line along the ridge, his breath pluming in the dawn light. He was looking for the heavy drag of a log, the sign that a bear had taken the bait and pulled the anchor. He found the drag marks, distinct and frantic, tearing up the frozen moss, but the tracks alongside them weren't bear paws. They were moccasins, small ones. Jed cursed, a low rumble in his chest, and unslung the Sharps rifle from his shoulder. He followed the trail down into a ravine choked with scrub oak. He saw her then. She was backed against a limestone overhang, her eyes black holes of panic and fury. She was Chiricahua Apache. Even in the dim light, he recognized the distinct cut of her buckskins. She couldn't have been more than 20. Her right leg was clamped tight in the jaws of a #6 Newhouse bear trap, the kind with teeth. The log drag was tangled in a mesquite root, pinning her there. She had exhausted herself trying to pull free, and the snow beneath her leg was black with blood. When she saw Jed, she didn't beg. She didn't cry out. She reached for a knife at her belt. Her hand was shaking, not from fear, but from the shock setting into her blood. "Easy, girl," Jed said, lowering the rifle but keeping it ready. He spoke the dialect of the mesmerized, rough but passable. "I am not Bluecoat. I am not enemy." She slashed the air with the knife, hitting a word that meant death. Jed looked at the leg. The bone was likely shattered. If he left her, the wolves or the cold would take her by nightfall. If he helped her, and her kin found him, they'd likely skin him alive for touching one of their women. But Jedediah Coulter had a code, one that didn't care about politics or race. You don't leave a living thing to suffer in the iron. He holstered the rifle and moved in. She slashed at him again, the blade nicking his heavy canvas coat. "Damn it, woman," Jed grunted. He lunged, not for the knife, but for her wrist. He caught it, twisting it sharply until the blade dropped into the snow. She fought like a mountain cat, clawing at his face with her free hand, spitting and kicking with her good leg. He had to be brutal to be kind. He pinned her against the rock, his weight holding her still. "Look at me," he roared in English, then switched to Apache. "Look at the iron. I have to open it." She stopped fighting, her chest heaving, her eyes darting to the trap. The realization of her helplessness broke her fury. She slumped back, squeezing her eyes shut. Jed knew he couldn't pry the jaws open with his hands. The springs were too strong. He needed his setting clamps, which were back at the cabin, 2 miles up. "I have to carry you," he said, "trap and all." He used the butt of his rifle to smash the chain link connecting the trap to the drag log. It took 3 heavy swings, the sound ringing like a church bell in the valley. The link snapped. He scooped her up, the heavy steel trap dangling from her mangled leg. She screamed then, a raw, guttural sound as the movement twisted the bone. Then her head lolled back. She had passed out. Jed adjusted his grip, feeling the terrifying lightness of her frame, and began the climb back to his cabin. He didn't know it yet, but he was carrying his own fate up that mountain. The cabin was a sturdy structure of ponderosa pine, chinked with mud and moss, sitting on a shelf of rock that offered a view of the valley. Jed kicked the door open and laid the woman on his own bunk, pushing aside the buffalo robes. He worked with the efficiency of a field surgeon. He stoked the fire in the potbelly stove until the iron glowed cherry red. He set a pot of water to boil and threw in a handful of salt. He found his screw clamps and applied them to the springs of the bear trap. Slowly, Agonizingly, he cranked the jaws open. The release of pressure caused the wound to gush fresh blood. The woman moaned in her unconscious state, her brow slick with sweat. The damage was severe. The teeth had torn the calf muscle and chipped the tibia, but the artery seemed intact. If the infection didn't kill her, the blood loss might. Jed cleaned the wound with boiling water and whiskey. He had no silk for stitches, so he used horsehair he'd been saving for fishing line, soaking it in the alcohol first. He sewed the jagged flesh back together, his large, calloused fingers moving with surprising delicacy. When he was done, he wrapped the leg in clean cotton torn from his spare shirt and splintered it with cedar shingles. He sat back, wiping the blood from his hands with a rag. He watched her chest rise and fall. She was beautiful, in a sharp, dangerous way. High cheekbones, a strong jaw, and hair as dark as a raven's wing. He brewed coffee and waited. It was late afternoon when she woke, her eyes snapped open, instantly alert. She tried to sit up, but the pain slammed her back down. She looked at her leg, then at Jed, who was whittling a piece of firewood by the stove. "Water," she rasped in Apache. Jed brought a tin cup to her lips. She drank greedily, then pulled back, eyeing him with suspicion. "My name is Kij," she said, her voice weak. "I am Coulter," Jed replied. "You set the trap." It wasn't a question. It was an accusation. For bear, not for people. "You were off the trail." "I was hunting," she said, defiance flashing in her eyes. "My husband, he died 3 moons ago. I hunt for myself." A widow. That explained why she was alone. Among the Apache, a widow often had a hard time if she had no brothers or uncles to support her. "Rest, Kij," Jed said. "You cannot walk. The bone needs time." "My people will come," she said, staring at the ceiling. They saw the drag marks. Jed felt a cold knot in his stomach. How many? She looked at him, and for a moment, he thought he saw a flicker of pity in her eyes. Enough. Night fell heavy and dark. The wind howled around the eaves of the cabin. Jed didn't sleep. He sat in a rocking chair with his Winchester across his lap, watching the door. Keisha slept fitfully, crying out in her dreams. Around 3 a.m., the horses in the corral out back nickered nervously. Jed stood up and blew out the oil lamp, plunging the room into darkness. He moved to the window, peering through a crack in the shutter. Nothing but shadows and snow. But Jed knew better. They were out there. Ghosts in the timber. He looked back at the woman on the bed. He could drag her out, use her as a shield, try to negotiate. But that wasn't his way. He checked the load in his rifle. If they came through that door, he'd take as many as he could before they took his hair. He waited. The silence stretched until it was almost deafening. Then the sun began to bleed over the horizon, painting the snow in shades of violet and orange. They didn't attack. Jed slowly opened the heavy timber door and stepped out onto the porch, his rifle lowered but ready. They were there. 12 of them, mounted on painted ponies, their breath steaming in the cold air. They formed a semicircle around the cabin. They wore the paint of war, streaks of black and yellow. In the center sat a man Jed recognized by reputation, if not by sight. It was Chatto, a sub-chief known for his tactical brilliance and his ruthlessness. He wore a heavy wool coat over his buckskins and held a repeating rifle resting on his saddle horn. Jed didn't raise his gun. He stood his ground. "Where is she?" Chatto asked. His voice was calm, carrying across the clearing. "Inside," Jed answered in Apache. "She is alive. I fixed her leg." Chatto stared at Jed for a long time. The other warriors watched their leader, fingers hovering near triggers. "Bring her out," Chatto commanded. Jed went back inside. Kiji was awake, pulling herself up. She had heard the voices. "They are here," Jed said. "Chatto." She went pale, her copper skin turning ashen. "Help me up." Jed supported her, acting as a crutch, and they hobbled out onto the porch. The cold air hit them. When the warriors saw Kija, saw the splint on her leg and the blood on her buckskins, a murmur went through the line. Kiji spoke to Chatto, her voice rapid and high. She explained the trap, the rescue, the sewing of the wound. Chatto listened, his face a mask of stone. When she finished, he looked at Jed. "You put the iron in the ground," Chatto said. "For the bear," Jed repeated. "But it bit the woman. It tasted her blood." Chatto dismounted. He walked up the steps of the porch, standing a head shorter than Jed, but radiating a terrifying intensity. He looked at Kija's leg. He touched the splint. Kija flinched. "She is marked now," Chatto said, turning to his men. "The iron spirit has claimed her leg. In our way, she is spoiled." Jed frowned. "She will heal. She will walk again." "It is not about the walking, White Eyes," Chatto spat. "It is the bad medicine. She was already a widow, unlucky. Now she carries the scar of the white man's trap. If we take her back, the bad medicine comes with her. It will sicken the tribe." Jed looked at Kija. She had lowered her head, shame burning her cheeks. She knew this custom, or perhaps she just knew Chatto's cruelty. "So what?" Jed asked, his grip tightening on his rifle. "You leave her here to die?" Chatto smiled, a cold, humorless twisting of lips. "No, we do not kill our own, but we cannot take her back. You broke her bone with your iron. You fixed her with your hands. You put your blood on her." Chatto remounted his horse. He looked down at Jed with a gaze that sealed a verdict. "By the law of the mountain and the debt of blood, she is yours. You saved her life, so now you must keep it. She is your wife now, your burden." Jed was stunned. "I didn't ask for a wife." "And she did not ask for the trap," Chatto replied. "If you cast her out, she will die, and a spirit will haunt you. If you return her to us, we will kill you both for bringing the curse into our camp." Chatto wheeled his horse around. "She is Kije of the Chiricahua. Treat her well, trapper. If we hear she suffers at your hand, we will come back. And next time we will not talk." With a yip and a kick of dust, the war party thundered away, vanishing into the tree line as quickly as they had appeared. Jed stood on the porch, the freezing wind cutting through his coat. He looked at the woman leaning against him, a stranger, an enemy, a widow, and now his wife. Kija looked up at him, her eyes hard and wet. "I will not cook for you," she whispered fiercely. Jed looked at the retreating dust cloud, then back at her. He almost laughed. "Let's get you inside before you freeze," he said. "Wife." The first week was a war of silence. Kija occupied the bunk, her leg elevated. Jed slept on a pile of furs on the floor near the door. The cabin, once a sanctuary of solitude, now felt crowded with tension. She refused his help with personal tasks as much as she could, dragging herself across the floor to the chamber pot, her jaw set in grim determination. She ate the stew he made, but stared at the wall while she did it. Jed went about his routine. He checked his trap lines, careful to avoid the area where she was caught, chopped wood, and skinned the beaver and fox he caught. But he felt her eyes on him constantly, assessing, judging. One evening, a blizzard struck the rim. The wind battered the cabin, shaking the timbers. The temperature dropped so low the water in the bucket froze solid a few feet from the stove. Jed sat by the fire, greasing his boots. "Why did you not let them kill me?" Kija asked suddenly. Her English was broken, but understandable. Jed didn't look up. "Not my place to decide who dies." "You are a strange white eye," she said. "Most would have shot me in the trap. Saved the trouble." "I ain't most men," Jed muttered. "Chatto hates me," she revealed, her voice softer. "My husband. He was Chatto's rival. When my husband died, Chatto wanted me to be his second wife. I refused. I spit at him." Jed stopped greasing his boot. He looked at her. The firelight danced on her face, softening the harsh lines of pain. So the trap was just an excuse, Jed realized. He used my trap to get rid of you without breaking tribal law. Kija nodded. "He thinks he punished us both. He saddled you with a cripple, and he exiled me to live with the enemy." Jed stood up and walked to the window, watching the snow swirl. "Well," he said, his voice rough, "he's half right. You're stubborn as a mule." A faint, dry sound came from the bed. It took Jed a moment to realize she was chuckling. "But he was wrong about one thing," Jed added, turning to face her. "I don't see an enemy." The dynamic shifted that night. The hostility didn't vanish, but it transformed into a wary truce. As her leg healed, Kija began to take over the cabin. She couldn't walk well yet, but she could work with her hands. She took Jed's torn shirts and mended them with intricate stitching that put his clumsy sewing to shame. She took the dried venison he chewed like leather and pounded it with fat and berries to make pemmican, which tasted better and lasted longer. She reorganized his supplies. She sharpened his skinning knives until they could split a hair. One evening, Jed came back with a buck deer draped over his shoulders. He dropped it on the porch and came inside, exhausted. He found the table set. Not just with the usual tin plates, but she had placed a sprig of pine in a jar of water as a centerpiece. The floor was swept clean. "You didn't have to do that," Jed said, washing his hands. "You are a bad hunter," she said, pointing to the deer outside. "That buck is old, tough meat. You should have taken the doe." "The doe had a fawn," Jed argued. "The fawn is weaned. Now we eat shoe leather." She smirked. Jed sat down, cutting a piece of the bread she had made in the Dutch oven. It was warm and soft. "Maybe," Jed said, taking a bite, "but the bread is good." They looked at each other, really looked at each other, for the first time without the filter of war or pain. Jed saw a woman of immense resilience. Keisha saw a man of quiet honor. But the world outside their cabin wasn't done with them. Spring came early to the high country. The snowmelt roared in the creeks. With the thaw came the cavalry. Jed was splitting wood when he heard the hoofbeats, heavy shod horses, not ponies. He grabbed his rifle and signaled Keisha, who was tanning a hide on the porch. She grabbed her crutch, a branch Jed had carved for her, and moved inside. 4 riders emerged from the tree line. They wore the dusty blue uniforms of the U.S. Army. Leading them was a man with a waxed mustache and eyes like polished flint. Major Sterling. Jed knew Sterling. He was a man who believed the only good Indian was a dead one, and he hunted Apache for sport as much as for duty. "Coulter!" Sterling shouted, pulling his horse up. "Damn good to see you. We heard you were still up here." "Major," Jed nodded, leaning on his axe. "What brings you this high?" "Geronimo has broken the reservation again," Sterling spat. "We're sweeping the rim, looking for stragglers, runners." Sterling's eyes drifted to the porch. He saw the tanning rack. He saw the beadwork on the moccasins drying by the door. He looked back at Jed, a cruel smile touching his lips. "You got company up here, Jed?" Sterling asked, his hand drifting to his service revolver. Jed's heart hammered against his ribs. If Sterling found Keisha, he wouldn't honor any tribal marriage. He'd see a hostile. He'd hang her, or worse. "Just me, Major," Jed lied smoothly, "and my squaw-man habits. I trade with them sometimes." Sterling leaned forward in his saddle. "Is that right? Because my scout, a man named Vance, he says he saw 2 sets of prints at the creek this morning. 1 heavy, 1 light, 1 limping." Sterling dismounted. "Mind if we take a look inside? Army regulations. Harboring the enemy is a hanging offense, Coulter, even for you." Jed stepped between Sterling and the door. He shifted his grip on the axe. "I mind," Jed said low. Sterling chuckled, but his eyes were cold. "Boys," he said to his troopers, "check the cabin." The air between the porch and the horses crackled like dry tinder. Major Sterling's hand hovered over his holster, his eyes flicking between Jed's axe and the closed door. "You're making a mistake, Coulter," Sterling warned, his voice low and dangerous. "Obstruction of justice. Treason." "I'm protecting my home," Jed growled. "You got no warrant." "I have the authority of the United States Cavalry," Sterling snapped. "Sergeant O'Malley, remove him." A burly trooper with a thick red beard swung his leg over his saddle, his boots hitting the frozen mud with a thud. He drew his saber, the steel hissing against the scabbard. Jed tightened his grip on the axe handle. He calculated the distance. He could take O'Malley, maybe throw the axe at Sterling, but the other 2 would cut him down before he drew his next breath. It was a suicide play. But before O'Malley could take a step, the cabin door creaked open. The sound was small, but it froze everyone. Keisha stepped out. She didn't look like a cripple. She didn't look like a victim. She stood tall, leaning only slightly on the doorframe. In her hands, she held Jed's spare shotgun, a sawed-off 10-gauge loaded with buckshot. She leveled the twin barrels directly at Major Sterling's chest. "Get out," she said. The English words were thick, accented, and heavy with venom. Sterling's horse danced nervously, sensing the tension. The Major stared at her, then at the massive bores of the shotgun. At this range, that gun wouldn't just kill him, it would erase him. "Well, well," Sterling sneered, though his hand moved away from his gun. "The trade speaks English, and she's armed. She's my wife," Jed said, his voice flat. "And she's got a twitchy finger, Major." Sterling looked at his men. They were uneasy. Nobody wanted to die for a routine sweep, especially not by a scattergun at 10 paces. "This isn't over, Coulter," Sterling spat, wheeling his horse around. "You're harboring a hostile. I'll be back with a platoon, and when I do, I'll burn this shack to the ground with both of you inside." "Ride on!" Jed roared. The patrol turned and galloped back towards the tree line, disappearing into the shadows of the pines. Jed didn't relax until the sound of hoofbeats faded entirely. He turned to Keisha. She was trembling now, the adrenaline fading, pain washing back into her leg. She lowered the gun. "You speak English," Jed said, taking the weapon from her before she dropped it. "I listen," she replied, clutching her leg. "You talk to yourself, Trapper, a lot." Jed let out a short, sharp laugh. "We have to go. Sterling wasn't lying. He'll be back by sundown with 20 men. "Where?" Keisha asked. "North, to the Badlands, into the canyon country where horses can't follow." "My leg? We ride the mules until the terrain gets too rough. Then I carry you again if I have to." They had 1 hour. It was a frantic, heart-breaking hour. Jed packed what they could carry: ammunition, dried meat, blankets, his coffee pot. He looked at the cabin, the home he had built log by log over 10 years. "We can't leave it for them," Jed said quietly. "They'll use it as an outpost to hunt us." Keisha understood. She took a burning log from the stove and threw it onto the pile of furs in the corner. Jed splashed the last of his kerosene over the table. They stood outside in the snow, watching the flames lick up the walls. The pine caught fast, the pitch in the wood exploding like gunfire. Black smoke punched a hole in the blue sky. "Now we are both ghosts," Keisha said, watching the fire reflect in her dark eyes. "Let's move," Jed said. He helped her onto his lead mule, Bess, and they turned their backs on the only safety they had known, heading straight into the unforgiving wilderness. 3 days later, they were deep in the labyrinth of the Mazatzal wilderness. It was a hellscape of vertical rock, cactus, and treacherous scree slopes. The weather had turned. A freezing rain lashed at them, soaking through their coats. They had abandoned the mules a day ago, when the trail became nothing but a goat path along a 1,000-foot drop. They were camped in a shallow cave, huddled together under a single buffalo robe. There was no fire. The smoke would give them away. Keisha's leg was swollen and hot. The exertion was tearing at the healing bone. She shivered violently, her teeth chattering. "You are burning up," Jed whispered, pressing his hand to her forehead. "I'm fine," she lied, her voice weak. "Leave me, Jed. You can move faster alone." It was the first time she had used his name. Jed pulled her closer, sharing his body heat. "I don't leave things in traps, remember?" "Why?" she asked, looking up at him in the gloom. "Why do you fight for me? I am Apache. You are White Eye. The world says we are enemies." "The world is wrong," Jed said. "I was a scout for Crook. I saw what the army did at Skeleton Cave. I saw them kill women and children who were trapped. I turned in my badge that day. I swore I'd never be part of that again." He looked at her. "When I saw you in that iron, I saw a chance to wash the blood off my hands." Keisha reached out and touched his bearded face. Her hand was rough, scarred, and gentle. "You are not like them," she whispered. "You have an Apache heart. Stubborn, stupid, brave." Jed chuckled softly. "Get some sleep, Keisha. You too, husband." The word hung in the air, no longer a sarcastic barb, but a quiet admission of their reality. They weren't just surviving. They were a unit. Morning brought a terrifying realization. Jed went to the cave mouth to check their back trail. He used his brass telescope to scan the canyon floor below. He saw them. Sterling hadn't given up. He had dismounted his men and they were tracking on foot, relentless as wolves. They were maybe 3 hours behind. But that wasn't the worst of it. Jed swung the glass to the ridgeline on the opposite side of the canyon. A flash of sunlight on metal caught his eye. Apache. Not just any Apache. He recognized the paint on the lead horse. Chato. Chato hadn't forgotten the bad medicine. He had been tracking Keisha too, likely to ensure she didn't return to the tribe, or perhaps to finish what the trap started. "We're boxed in," Jed said, sliding back into the cave. "Sterling below. Chato above." Keisha struggled to sit up. "Chato is here?" "Aye, on the ridge. We're caught between the hammer and the anvil." Keisha's eyes hardened. The fever seemed to recede, replaced by the cold focus of a warrior. "Then we make them strike each other," she said. How? There is a box canyon ahead. Dead Man's Drop. Only one way in. If we go there, Sterling will follow. He will think he has us cornered. And Chatto? Chatto will be watching. He hates the Bluecoats more than he hates us. If he sees Sterling, he will not be able to resist. It's a gamble, Jed said. If Chatto decides to kill us first, we're done. It is a good day to die, Keisha said, checking the load in the shotgun, but a better day to kill. The midday sun hammered down on the red rocks of the Mogollon Rim until the air itself seemed to shimmer and warp. In the box canyon known to the locals as Dead Man's Drop, there was no wind to cool the sweat that ran in rivulets down Jedediah Coulter's back. There was only the heat, the oppressive silence of the high desert, and the sickening realization that the map had run out. They had been pushed hard for 3 days. The terrain had shifted from the pine-studded slopes of the high country to this jagged scar of sandstone and scrub brush. The canyon was a natural cul-de-sac, a geological trap formed millions of years ago by water that had long since dried up. The walls rose 300 feet on 3 sides, sheer vertical faces of rusted stone that offered no handholds, no escape, and no mercy. The only way in was the way they had come, a narrow, twisting throat of rock that was now filled with the rising dust cloud of the approaching cavalry. Jed slid his back down against the rough grit of a fallen boulder. It was a massive slab of sandstone, toppled from the rim centuries ago, landing in a way that created a small, defensible pocket at the very back of the canyon. It was good cover, sturdy enough to stop a buffalo rifle slug, but it was also a tomb. He looked at Keisha. She was propped up against the adjacent rock, her injured leg stretched out before her. The journey had been brutal on her. The makeshift splint was frayed, the leather ties worn thin. Her buckskins were stained with mud and dried blood, and her face was drawn, the skin tight against her high cheekbones. Her eyes, usually dark and sharp as obsidian, were glassy with pain and fatigue. But she held the sawed-off 10-gauge shotgun across her lap with a grip that hadn't faltered. Water, Jed rasped, unhooking the canteen from his belt. It was light. Too light. He shook it. A pathetic, sloshing sound answered him. Maybe 3 swallows left. He handed it to her. "No," she whispered, her voice like dry leaves. "You drink. You need the steady hand." "I'm steady enough," Jed lied. He uncorked it and forced it into her hand. "Drink, Keisha. That's an order." She glared at him. That same fierce, defiant glare she had given him when he first found her in the trap, but she lifted the canteen. She took a small sip, wetting her cracked lips, and handed it back. "They are close," she said, looking towards the canyon mouth. The rumble of hoofbeats was vibrating through the ground now, a low tremor that they felt in their bones before they heard it with their ears. "Aye," Jed said, checking the action on his Sharps rifle. He opened the breech, the brass cartridge gleaming in the sunlight, and snapped it shut. 10 minutes behind us, maybe less. Sterling pushed his horses hard. "He wants you," Keisha said softly. "He wants you more than he wants me." "He wants a victory," Jed corrected. "He's a man who measures his worth in dead bodies. Doesn't matter if they're Apache or white men who don't toe the line. To him, we're just trophies for his wall." Jed crawled to the edge of the boulder and peered through the shimmering heat haze. The entrance to the box canyon was about 200 yards away. It was a kill zone. Anyone coming through that gap would be exposed for a good 50 yards before they could find cover among the scree and scrub oak. But Jed knew the arithmetic of war. He had 1 single-shot rifle and a Colt Peacemaker on his hip. Keij had the shotgun, effective only at close range. Major Sterling had 12 men, repeating Winchesters, and enough ammunition to fight a small war. "Keisha," Jed said, not turning back, keeping his eyes on the sights. "When the shooting starts, don't let them take you alive." It was a brutal thing to say. A heavy, terrible thing. But in the West, in 1878, it was an act of love. They both knew what happened to Apache women in the custody of men like Sterling. Keys checked the hammers on the shotgun. "I have 2 shells in the gun," she said calmly, "and 1 in my pocket. 1 for the Bluecoats, 1 for the Bluecoats, and the last one for the spirit world." Jed closed his eyes for a second, swallowing the lump in his throat. He reached back, his hand finding hers in the dust. Her fingers interlaced with his, squeezing hard. "I'm sorry," he whispered. "I should have got you out. I should have gone north sooner." "You saved me from the iron," she replied, her voice steady. "You gave me a winter of warmth. You gave me a husband who does not beat me. Do not apologize, Jedediah. It has been a good life. Short, but good." The sound of horses grew louder, shifting from a rumble to the distinct clatter of shod hooves on stone. Then the jingle of bit chains, the creak of saddle leather. "Here we go," Jed muttered. He released her hand and brought the stock of the heavy buffalo gun to his shoulder. Major Sterling rode into the canyon mouth first. He sat tall in the saddle, arrogant and unafraid. He knew where the canyon went. He knew his quarry had nowhere to run. He held up a gloved hand, and his troopers fanned out behind him, forming a skirmish line. Dust swirled around their blue wool uniforms, coating the yellow stripes on their pant legs. They looked ragged. Sterling had driven them relentlessly, likely killing a few horses in the process, but the scent of blood had revitalized them. They unslung their carbines, eyes scanning the rocks at the far end of the canyon. Sterling pulled a spyglass from his saddlebag and extended it. He swept the canyon floor until his lens settled on the cluster of boulders where Jed lay. "Coulter!" Sterling's voice boomed, magnified by the acoustic funnel of the canyon walls. "I know you're back there. Come out. There's nowhere left to run, you stubborn son of a bitch." Jed stayed silent. He adjusted the vernier sight on the sharps, calculating the drop. 200 yards, uphill slightly. No wind. "Come on now, Jed," Sterling called out, walking his horse a few paces forward. "Make it easy on yourself. Send the woman out. If she surrenders peacefully, I'll see she gets a fair trial at Fort Verde. You have my word as an officer." "Your word ain't worth the spit to shine your boots, Major," Jed shouted back. His voice was gravel and thunder. Sterling laughed, a harsh, barking sound. "Have it your way. But remember, you chose this. Sergeant O'Malley, dismount. Skirmishers forward." The troopers swung down from their saddles. Horseholders grabbed the reins of the mounts and retreated to the safety of the canyon wall. 8 men moved forward, rifles at the ready, using the scattered rocks for cover. "Watch the flanks," Jed murmured to himself. He saw a trooper moving aggressively on the left, trying to get an angle behind their boulder. The man was young, eager, moving too fast. He broke cover, sprinting for a mesquite bush. Jed exhaled. He squeezed the trigger. The sharps roared like a cannon. The heavy .45, 70 slug slammed into the trooper's chest, lifting him off his feet and throwing him backward into the dust. The sound of the shot slapped back and forth against the canyon walls, deafening in the enclosed space. "Open fire! Pour it on them!" Sterling screamed. The canyon erupted. 8 Winchester repeaters opened up simultaneously. The air around Jed and Kij filled with the angry buzz of hornets. Bullets smacked into the sandstone boulder, sending showers of rock chips and razor-sharp dust into their faces. Jed ducked, reloading with practiced speed. He dropped the breech block, ejected the smoking brass casing, slid a fresh cartridge in, and snapped it shut. He popped up, acquired a target, a muzzle flash near a dead cedar tree, and fired. He missed. The bullet pulverized the wood, sending splinters flying, but the trooper scrambled away. "My turn," Kija hissed. She dragged herself to the left side of the boulder. A soldier had gotten bold, rushing forward to a rock only 30 yards away. He popped up to fire, thinking he had an angle on Jed. He didn't see Kija. She pulled the trigger on the right barrel. The 10-gauge buckshot spread was devastating. It caught the man in the shoulder and neck, spinning him around and dropping him instantly. "Cover!" Sterling roared. "Keep their heads down!" The volume of fire intensified. The soldiers were suppressing them now, firing in a rhythm that gave Jed no time to aim. Bullets chipped away the top of their rock shelter. A ricochet whined inches past Jed's ear, stinging his cheek with hot lead spray. "I can't get a clean shot," Jed yelled over the din. "They are moving up," Kija shouted back. She broke the shotgun open, ejecting the spent shell and loading her last spare round. "They are bounding. One fires, one moves." It was standard military tactics. Sterling was pinning them down with volume while his men closed the noose. They were tightening the circle. 70 yards, 60 yards. Jed took a risk. He rolled out from the cover of the main boulder to a smaller rock, exposing himself for a fraction of a second. He saw the sergeant, the big, red-bearded man, directing fire. Jed fired from the hip, A snap shot. The bullet took the sergeant in the thigh. The man screamed and went down, but he kept firing his pistol from the ground. A sudden impact slammed into Jed's left shoulder like a sledgehammer. He grunted, the rifle slipping from his numb fingers. He spun around, falling back behind the main boulder. "Jed!" Kij scrambled to him, her eyes wide. He looked at his shoulder. The heavy canvas coat was torn, dark blood pulsing rapidly from the wound. It was a through and through, likely missing the bone, but tearing the muscle. The pain was a white-hot poker branding him deep. "I'm all right," he gasped, his face draining of color. He reached for the rifle with his good hand. "Just lost my grip." "Let me see," she demanded, tearing a strip from her sleeve to press against the wound. "No time," Jed grimaced, pushing her hand away. "How many shells you got left?" Keisha looked at the shotgun. "One in the chamber, none in the pocket." Jed checked his belt. "I got 3 bullets, Keisha, and 6 men still on their feet." The firing stopped. The silence that followed was heavier than the noise. It was the silence of the predator crouching before the pounce. "Coulter!" Sterling's voice was closer now. 50 yards. "That was a solid hit. I saw you spin. You're bleeding out, man. Give it up." Jed slumped against the rock, his breath coming in ragged gasps. The blood loss was making him dizzy. The canyon walls seemed to be leaning in, closing the trap. "Go to hell, Sterling," Jed wheezed. "Have it your way," Sterling replied. "Fix bayonets." The sound of steel sliding onto steel barrels scraped across the silence. Clack, 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 clack. It was a terrifying sound, primal and final. They weren't going to shoot anymore. They were going to rush the position and finish it with blades. "This is it," Jed said softly. He awkwardly transferred the rifle to his left hand, wincing, and drew his Colt revolver with his right. "Kij, the last shell." She looked at him. She looked at the shotgun. She looked at the knife at her belt. "I will not use it on myself," she said, her eyes burning with a terrifying resolve. "If they want my spirit, they must come and take it." "Ready?" Jed asked. "Ready, husband." "Charge!" Sterling screamed. 6 men rose from the rocks, bayonets leveled, screaming a war cry that was meant to paralyze with fear. They sprinted across the open ground, boots pounding the dust. 40 yards, 30. Jed raised the Colt. He aimed at the lead runner. He squeezed the trigger. Click! Misfire. The hammer fell on a bad primer. Jed cursed, thumbing the hammer back again. 20 yards. Kije raised the shotgun. She had 1 shot. She had to wait until they were on top of them. Suddenly, a shadow swept over the canyon floor. It wasn't a cloud. It was too fast. From the sheer rim of the canyon, 300 feet above, a sound erupted that froze the blood in every man's veins. It was not a human sound. It was the shriek of a raptor, high, piercing, and undulating. "Yee yee 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 yee!" The soldiers faltered in their charge, looking up. Sterling, standing in the rear, looked up. The rim of the canyon, previously empty, was suddenly lined with silhouettes. 20 mounted warriors. They sat on their painted ponies like statues carved from the rock itself, backlit by the blinding sun. At the center was a figure wearing a heavy wool coat over buckskins, a repeating rifle held high above his head. Chatto. For a second, time stopped. The soldiers were caught in the open, bayonets fixed, staring up at their worst nightmare. Chatto dropped his hand. The sky rained death. It didn't begin with gunfire. It began with arrows. A silent, hissing volley arched down from the heights. Gravity did the work. The shafts punched through the air with terrifying velocity. One soldier took an arrow through the shoulder, pinning him to the ground. Another took one through the throat. The charge shattered instantly. Then the rifles spoke. The warriors on the rim opened fire. They had the ultimate high ground. They were shooting down into a barrel. The acoustics of the canyon turned the volley into a continuous, rolling thunder. "Ambush!" Sterling screamed, his voice cracking with panic. "Retreat! Fall back to the horses!" But there was nowhere to go. The soldiers scrambled, slipping on the loose shale, trying to find cover that didn't exist. The rocks they had used to hide from Jed offered no protection from the enemy directly above them. It was a slaughter. Jed watched in stunned disbelief. He lowered his gun. The soldier he had been about to shoot was now lying face down in the dirt, a Winchester slug in his back. "They aren't shooting at us," Keezer whispered, staring up at the rim. "They are killing the bluecoats." Major Sterling was trying to mount his horse, which was rearing in terror. He had lost his hat. His uniform was dusty. The arrogance was gone, replaced by the animal fear of a man who realizes he is no longer the hunter. "Mount up! Ride! Ride!" Sterling screamed, kicking his horse. He made it 10 yards. From the rim, Chatto leveled his rifle. He didn't fire rapidly. He took his time. He aimed with the patience of a man who had waited months for this moment. The shot cracked, sharp and distinct above the din. Major Sterling jerked violently in the saddle. The bullet took him high in the chest, punching through his sternum. He slumped forward, grabbing the mane of his horse, then slid slowly sideways, falling into the red dust of the canyon floor. He didn't move again. The remaining 3 soldiers didn't look back. They abandoned their wounded, abandoned their dignity, and sprinted for the canyon mouth, disappearing into the dust cloud, running for their lives. The firing from the rim stopped as abruptly as it had begun. The silence that rushed back into Dead Man's Drop was profound. The smell of black powder hung thick and sulphurous in the air, mixing with the metallic scent of blood. Jed slowly pushed himself up to a sitting position, clutching his bleeding shoulder. He looked around. The canyon floor was littered with blue uniforms. The threat was gone. He looked up. The warriors were still there, lining the cliff edge like sentinels. They hadn't celebrated. They hadn't cheered. They simply watched. Chatto sat on his horse, staring down into the pit. The distance was great, but the air was clear. Jed could see the paint on Chatto's face, black and yellow, the colors of death and lightning. Kiza used the boulder to pull herself up. She stood on her one good leg, leaning heavily on the rock, but she stood tall. She looked up at the man who had cast her out, the man who had condemned her to the bear trap. She raised her hand, palm open, towards the sky. It was a gesture of acknowledgement, not gratitude exactly, but recognition. Chatto looked at her. He looked at the splint on her leg. He looked at the dead major lying in the dirt. Then he looked at Jed. The 2 men locked eyes across the vertical distance, the mountain man and the Apache chief. There was a history of blood between their peoples, a history of broken treaties and stolen lands. But in this moment, on this bloody afternoon, there was something else. Respect. Chatto nodded. It was a barely perceptible movement, a single dip of his chin. He turned his horse away from the edge. He barked a command, and the line of warriors turned with him. In seconds, they melted back into the landscape, vanishing as if they had been spirits conjured by the heat. Jed exhaled, a long, shuddering breath that racked his ribs. He holstered his Colt. "Why?" Jed asked, his voice raspy. "He could have killed us all. He had us in the palm of his hand." Kaj slid down the rock, sitting beside him. She began to tear the rest of her sleeve to bind his shoulder properly. Her hands were shaking now that the adrenaline was fading. "He did not do it for you," she said quietly, winding the cloth around his arm. "And he did not do it for me." "Then why?" She tightened the bandage, making Jed wince. She looked at the body of Major Sterling. "Because Sterling was a butcher," she said, "and Chatto is a warrior. A warrior knows who the real enemy is. Today, the enemy of my enemy was my brother." She paused, looking deeply into Jed's eyes. She reached up and wiped a smear of dirt from his forehead. "But there is more," she admitted. "He saw you stand. He saw you bleed for me. In the eyes of the people, you are no longer White Eye. You have earned your place." Jed looked at the empty rim where the Apache had stood. "Does that mean we can stop running?" Keisha rested her head on his uninjured shoulder. The sun was beginning to dip, casting long, purple shadows across the canyon floor. "No," she said softly. "The army will come back. More will come. But we do not have to run today. Today, we rest." Jed wrapped his good arm around her. They sat there among the carnage, 2 survivors in a land that wanted them dead, holding on to the only thing that the trap, the winter, and the war couldn't take from them. "Let's go home, Keija," Jed whispered, though they both knew they had no home but each other. "Let's go north." "North is good," she murmured, her eyes closing. "North has big bears. You will need a bigger trap." Jed laughed, a painful wheezing sound that felt like victory. The sun set over Dead Man's Drop, painting the red rocks the color of blood. But for Jedediah and Keisha, the night promised the cool, quiet safety of the stars. The cabin was built of spruce, not pine, and the wind that howled outside carried the scent of ice, not desert dust. "We are deep in the Yukon territory now," a place where the maps are just blank paper, and the law is whatever a man makes of it. Jedediah Coulter sat on the rough-hewn porch, a thick fur blanket draped over his legs. He was oiling a trap, not a bear trap, but a smaller one for marten and fox. His shoulder still ached when the weather turned, a permanent barometer of the storm. The door behind him opened, spilling warm yellow light onto the snow. Kij stepped out. She moved differently now. The limp was still there, a hitch in her step that would never truly leave, but she moved with strength. She wore furs tailored in the style of the northern tribes, but the beadwork on her moccasins was distinctively Chiricahua, a pattern of mountains and lightning. She handed him a steaming mug of coffee, black and bitter, just the way he liked it. "You are staring at the dark again," she said, her English much improved, though the lilt of her native tongue still softened the edges of the words. "Just thinking," Jed said, taking the cup, "about the rim." "That is a ghost life," she said, sitting on the bench beside him. "Let the ghosts have it." "Do you think they tell stories about us?" Jed asked, glancing at her. "Down there." Kij smiled, her teeth white in the darkness. "The Apache are great storytellers. They tell the story of the woman of iron, and the white wolf who chewed off his own leg to stay with her." Jed chuckled, shaking his head. "I didn't chew off my leg, and I ain't a wolf." "It makes for a better story," she teased, bumping his shoulder with hers. "And Chatto, he will tell them that he spared us because he feared your terrible aim would accidentally hit his men." "My aim is just fine," Jed grumbled, feigning insult. "Is it?" She raised an eyebrow. "You missed the deer last week." "The wind shifted," Jed defended. They sat in comfortable silence for a long time, watching the sky. Slowly the aurora borealis began to unfurl above them, ribbons of green and violet dancing across the stars. It was a sight that never failed to humble them. "It is beautiful," Kija whispered. "It is," Jed agreed. He wasn't looking at the sky. He was looking at her. He reached out and took her hand. The scars were still there, on his palms and on her leg, reminders of the pain that had brought them together. But pain was just the price of admission for the life they had built. In the vast, frozen silence of the north, the mountain man and the Apache widow had found the one thing more powerful than war, more enduring than stone, and stronger than any iron trap. They had found peace. And so, the legend of Jedediah Coulter and Kij fades into the northern lights. It's a story that reminds us that sometimes the person you are supposed to hate is the only one who can save you. They defied their people, the army, and death itself to rewrite their own destiny. Now I have a question for you. Do you think Chatto made the right call? Was it honor that stayed his hand, or was it just a convenient way to strike a blow against the cavalry? And would you be able to leave everything behind to start over in the frozen north, like Jed and Kija? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. If you enjoyed this saga of the Wild West, please hit that like button. It really helps the channel. Don't forget to subscribe and ring the bell so you never miss a story. Thanks for watching, and as always, keep your powder dry.